NASA's Amiga collection. More about this and other stories on This Week in Retro.
High-resolution color graphics.
This land of high technology.
The revolution in technology that made the information age possible.
Those kids are not afraid of computers.
A mysterious new Zelda game appears.
A never-before-seen Mario game is unearthed.
Amigas at NASA.
And the Simpsons get unreal.
All this and our community question of the week on This Week in Retro. Up-to-date news
for out-of-date tech. Neil, what's the first thing that you do when you get to a hotel room?
Well, it's been a while, given the circumstances of the world, since I've been to a hotel. But the first thing I probably do is test the bed is comfortable. My favourite technique for that is probably the full body flop. You know, face first, arms out, straight onto the bed. By the way, anyone watching who's disgusted by the fact that I'm wearing a hoodie today, it's DIY day, so do excuse the lack of a shirt today. I'm looking a bit casual. So yeah, probably the bed, and then probably the bathroom. You've got to check that the bathroom's fit for human use. I think those are the two most important things for me. Yeah. How about you, John? What are your bedroom or hotel room checks?
I head straight to the bathroom and I check out the bathrobe situation. If you're staying at a hotel with a bathrobe, that's how you know you've made it, Neil. Unfortunately, I still haven't made it. I always look. I'm always disappointed. But after I do that, I usually familiarize myself with all the little bottles of soap and shampoo. I turn that AC on to max and settle in for an evening of binge TV watching and pizza delivery. But it wasn't always this way. Back in the 90s and early aughts, hotels experimented with entertainment options beyond cable TV. And I'm not talking about the old magic fingers bed massage either. Well, maybe I am a little bit, but I'm not talking about that in this story. I'm talking about game consoles, Neil. Game consoles hooked up and ready to go from Jump Street, attached to your hotel's TV. Neil, did you ever come across a Super Nintendo or an N64 hooked up to a TV in your local inn?
No. I can remember, well, I can't ever remember seeing a console in my room. And I did do a lot of traveling for work in the noughties, or the aughts, as you called them. I've not called them the aughts before, but it's a good term. I think the closest I saw was probably one of those terrible games that used to appear on our TVs. Around about the time we got Sky TV, the satellite service over here, we started getting set-top boxes instead of just aerials on our roofs and satellite dishes. And in those set-top boxes, we would get games. A very famous one over here was called Beehive Bedlam. And it was basically just Puzzle Bobble or Bust a Move with bees. So I would see things like that in hotel rooms sometimes. And I was acutely aware of the legends of TVs with built-in Super Nintendos and things like that. So I was always on the lookout for them. But I never actually came across one in the wild myself, no.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure at least once I saw an N64 hooked up to a TV at a hotel I stayed at. I'm almost certain that I saw one, but I don't remember messing around with it, mostly because I had a feeling it would incur some kind of charge added to my bill at the end of my stay. And my assumptions were right, Neil. Thanks to a story shared with us by This Week in Retro subreddit user Quinmang, a company called LodgeNet partnered with Nintendo to produce the Gateway series of consoles. Gateway was the brand name. First, the Super Nintendo, and then followed by the N64. This thing was called the Gateway 64. It boasted dozens of titles that were rentable by the hour, including games you'd expect like Super Mario 64 and Smash Brothers, but it also included some pretty odd choices like Paper Mario and Ocarina of Time, which is the subject of this story. So, Neil, we've talked about other Zelda games in the past. Zelda has come up before on the show, oddly enough, but I think this is the first time we've ever had a story about Link's inaugural 64-bit outing. Did you play this one much back in the day?
Yeah, I did play it, and I actually owned this one back in the day during my brief fling with the N64. It was sold to me on the back of the previews that I saw in Edge magazine and other gaming magazines. And the previews, they promised these endless rolling hills that you could roam around on horseback. There was always the famous screenshot of Link with the horse rearing up and the sunset behind filtering through the horse and all silhouetted and lovely. And it just blew my mind, those beautiful sunsets and those rolling hills. And I really thought I was going to be able to explore as far as the horizon went in this game. And I think that was the intention. a lot of these promises were lost with the double D system, wasn't it? The disk drive system for the N64.
Yeah, the 64DD.
Yeah. So I think a lot of that exploring was supposed to be tied in with the extra capacity of that, but it was lost when that flopped. It was certainly never sold over here in the UK, so it was stripped back for the cartridge. So either they were baseless claims and hype in the first place, or that's why we lost that. So initially I was a bit disappointed when I played the game. It wasn't quite as free roaming as promised, but it was such a charming game. You know, from the music to the style to the characters that you spoke to, it really did grow on me quite quickly. So despite my initial disappointment about the exploration, I soon did forget about that, and I really got into the game. And also, I remember from that moment forward, every school kid in the country knew what an ocarina is. Having never heard of one before, suddenly everyone knew what it was. There was this surge of interest in schools, and they were even having lessons in them instead of the more traditional recorder that we had in schools. Kids were having ocarina lessons, and they were appearing in the school choir and things like that. So that, I think, is a really nice cultural impact as well, an example of that on society of a video game.
Yeah, as a present day teacher of music myself, I can tell you that kids still play all of the songs from this game. They play the forest theme, they play Epona's theme, all of the songs from this game. I don't know what it is that has made this game have the musical lasting impact, other than the fact that it's a brilliant soundtrack. Kids today still play this music all the time on their band instruments, so I think that's pretty cool. But in terms of the hype, I was right there with you. You know, I would pour over previews and Nintendo Power, and I would just make these scenarios in my head where it's like, what if there was a game where you could just get on your horse and you could just go, and it would take you like an hour to get somewhere, but you'd be passing through the hills and the forest, and you'd pass through villages and things. And of course, it would be impossible for a game of that era to really live up to the hype in my mind. But that was the ship that launched my wallet to buy a Nintendo 64. I decided this was what I was gonna cast my fate to. So the Gateway 64 version of Ocarina of Time has always been different than the retail release. According to the story, which is over at ZeldaUniverse.net, instead of beginning the game as a child, as baby Link or whatever, you start the game as adult Link. And, well, other than that, we really don't know what the other differences are. Not much has been known about this game because the ROM has never been dumped until now. The Nintendo preservation group Forest of Illusion has figured out a way to dump these ROMs and have them put up on the Internet Archive for people to explore. So, you know me, Neil, I don't hold any stock with software piracy. But even the most dyed-in-the-wool, clean-nosed gamer probably wouldn't have a problem with this kind of preservation, as there's no other way to play this version of the game. So, Neil, do you see any kind of ethical quandary with this whole situation? Is there a line of distinction between piracy and preservation?
It's a good question. Just before I come to that, we were just talking about the promises of this game, and I don't think, thinking about it, I don't think the what was promised and what I really wanted was realized probably until Skyrim. I know there were games that came before it that did it in 3D, but in terms of the amount of detail that I really wanted and the size and the fantasy setting, it was probably Skyrim where I really felt, I'm riding my horse across miles.
You are 100% right, and I have a feeling you're not the only one that feels that way. For me, it was exactly the same thing when I popped in Skyrim. I played Oblivion, but I played it on the 360, and I mean, my Xbox literally locked up every 15 minutes on the dot. So it wasn't a pleasant experience. When I played Skyrim for the first time, it was like the promises of Ocarina of Time had finally come true. Yeah,
absolutely. So back to the question of piracy and preservation. Let's not sugarcoat it. Yes, it is piracy. It absolutely is piracy in black and white. Is there an ethical question to answer? Normally, that's a bit more clear-cut, but this is Zelda that we're talking about. It's a 35-year-old game franchise that has had a big impact on video games and culture as a whole. Just the musical example was just one small example as part of that. So I don't think that necessarily makes piracy ethical, but I do think Nintendo should have a duty of care almost to make sure that it does play its part in preserving video game heritage. And that might not mean making a ROM available to everyone, but at least make sure that it is safely preserved and it's accessible in some form or another. If that means going to a museum to play it and try it out, then fine, so long as it's accessible in some way. Yeah, I haven't got a clear answer for you. Is it piracy? Is it preservation? It's somewhere in between. I can't imagine we're going to be rushing out to play this hotel version of Zelda. What's the situation with saving the game and coming back to it, the next day? It's weird. I think I read and I saw that you actually start the game as adult Link rather than child
and they have hard coded in sort of a patched together saving system, so you are able to save the game, but I haven't really heard anything other than that so far.
Yeah, but I think thinking about the bigger picture, I think there does need to be a way that if I wanted to go and study this game and see this game and find out what it's all about, in the way perhaps a researcher does, going to the British Museum to see some rare artifact or to go through their archives, then that should be possible either in person or digitally with video games. And I think the Nintendos and the Segas of the world, I think if they don't start thinking seriously about their heritage beyond the value of a franchise in terms of future sales, can we recycle this franchise? I think they need to think beyond that and think about the value of what they've created to culture as a whole. And I think they're going to regret it if they don't do that soon. It's going to be too late if they're not careful, and things are going to be lost. So I think they need to think about it. Yeah.
So if you're interested in checking out the work that Forest Evolution are doing, just follow them on Twitter. We'll put a link in the show notes to more information about the Gateway 64 system.
John, would you believe it? This is episode 49 of This Week in Retro. Nearly the big 50, the big 50. And we wouldn't have got here without the listeners, the twirlers. It's not really a nickname that I think is going to stick. Twirler.
I've got those in my band.
But it's also with huge thanks to and for the belief in us that came from people like RetroRewind.ca. They've supported us from very early on as we've pulled ourselves up from our bootstraps, and we really, really are appreciative of their support. Now, if you don't know RetroRewind.ca, it's a website that you should check out for anything that's Commodore related. Recap kits, accessories, add-ons, upgrades for your Amigas, Commodore 64s, VIC-20s, C16s, anything like that. RetroRewind.ca is the place we recommend you go. We've had some really good feedback from listeners who have actually used the service, and that's why we're always so happy to recommend them and to have them associated with the show, because we certainly wouldn't peddle people that we don't believe in, and Retro Rewind are a company and a people in Frank, who's behind the company, who we really do believe are doing great things and doing things for the right reason to preserve retro. So huge thanks to them. Make sure you make them your first port of call to preserve your machines, preferably before the magic smoke is released. Stay on top of your maintenance of your precious Commodore machines. And we say a huge thanks to RetroRewind.ca. Please do go and check them out. How strange, John, that hot on the heels of the Zelda story comes the other Nintendo franchise with its own discovery. We're talking today about the Museum of Home Computing over in Holland. Now, over there, they boast the world's largest collection of CDI titles. This should perhaps come as no surprise. I mean, the fact that Philips was founded over there. The company was founded in Eindhoven, and it grew to become the international success that it is. And as a result, you find a lot more CDI, and also I find a lot of MSX stuff in the Netherlands because Philips were producing MSX machines as well. So all sorts of interesting stuff in their country, and a really interesting and slightly different thread of computer history to what we get in the UK and again in the US. Now, they are in possession of a large archive of CDI titles, but they weren't really sure what they had. You know how it is. You have donations, you collect things, and there's always a big pile that you'll get to one day to go through an inventory and an archive. And that's what they've caught up with their CDI collection. The museum set volunteers the task of creating the inventory of CDI titles, and in them, they found some undiscovered Mario history. Now, before we get to that, John, we know that Mario and Zelda also have appeared on the CDI. They don't exactly have a great reputation, the CDI versions of these games like Hotel Mario and Zelda The Wand of Gamelon. Have you ever tried them, or for that matter, any other CDI titles, John?
I've tried my best to avoid them.
Okay. Not a single title, CDI title?
Never.
No.
Never. Their reputation precedes them.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I've played the Zelda or Mario titles. The game that was always being demonstrated on the CDI when it was in the shops, when I went to a store, was a golf game called Palm Springs, I think it was called. And on the face of it, it did look really impressive. It had these photorealistic courses. It had a digitized golfer, and when he swung the club, there were so many frames of animation, it just blew anything else in the shop away. It was a really nice looking thing. All the cartridge systems that were around it, the Mega Drive, the Super Nintendo, even we had things like the 32X coming along then, the Amiga CD32. They just paled in comparison. When the CDI was playing to its strengths, which was this video stuff, and not, once you scratch below the surface, the actual gameplay. If you looked past the video, there was an infinite amount more gameplay in games like PGA Tour Golf on your Mega Drive than there was in this sort of video golf on the CDI. So the CDI was all about playing videos, and playing videos with button presses, and then they would call those games. That's pretty much.
I think that's what Dragon Slayer is too, right?
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. And when it tried to do things more video game like, including Mario games, it generally fell flat on its face. The only exception I can think of is Tetris, which doesn't really push the machine that hard. There is a really good version of Tetris on the CDI, but as soon as you stand it up with a game that can go head to head, like for like, against another machine, a good example is Micro Machines. It's just a complete dog's dinner compared to other platforms. The scrolling, the speed of Micro Machines on the CDI compared to the earlier Mega Drive or the Super Nintendo or even the Amiga 500 is just awful. It's impressive in a way that they even got it to run on the CDI. So, anyway, going back to the museum, what has been discovered? Well, on an unlabeled CD at the museum, the volunteers found a game by the name of Super Mario's Wacky Worlds. I think Amiga Aaron would like that name.
Oh, yeah.
And this game was created by Nova Logic. Now, that's a game studio that you might be familiar with. I associate them with the voxel-based simulations that they used to do. So Comanche, Delta Force, Armored Fist, games like that. A really capable studio. And this Mario game was supposed to be a sequel to Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, so quite a high bar to meet. Now, it's very exciting that they found this on a CD, and it does still work. They popped it in and it loaded right up. And no doubt they very quickly archived it. But it isn't the first time this particular game has been seen. There are 3 other copies that are known to exist in the wild, or at least 3. So this is probably the 4th. And if you do a quick YouTube search, you can see footage of it in its incomplete form because the game was only about 30% complete. And you can see some glimpses of the game on YouTube, what it looked like. It does look like a pretty game. It looks like it could have been just as capable as Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo. It moves a lot better than Micro Machines. Yeah, but that in itself isn't a good thing when you think about the CDI was supposed to be a next generation console to the Super Nintendo and the other games. So to meet the same level and to not actually be any better, I believe
they call that the Amiga CD32, Neil.
Yeah, it just really emphasizes that it's the same quality. It just has a CD drive slapped on top of it. So, and that ultimately was the problem with the CDI. It wasn't driving anything new forward. So it is an impressive discovery, despite the failings of the CDI. It's an important piece of computing history. It did drive that multimedia movement forward and taught us as much through its mistakes as it did through its successes, I think. So it's an important piece of history. And it's an impressive discovery by the museum and the team at the Home Computer Museum over in the Netherlands. And just another example of the wealth of rare and exciting things that they have there to discover. So make sure the Home Computer Museum is on your bucket list of places to visit. It's certainly on mine.
Neil, when you think of NASA, what comes to mind?
The first thing that comes into my head with NASA is buzz cuts. Rows of computers, nerdy people in glasses, spinning dials. They're all sitting there tapping keyboards, all in a row, and Capcom is barking orders at the front. I'm basically just thinking of the movie Apollo 13, but that is the first thing that I think of with NASA. Yeah, how about you?
You know, Neil, you and I are cut from the same cloth, my friend, because that's exactly what I think of, too. I think about, rows and rows of board operators in front of those, green screen CRTs. They're all chain smoking. They're all drinking coffee. They're doing calculations by hand. It's basically, like you said, it's Apollo 13. Mm-hmm. I know it may be weird, but that image comes to mind faster than astronauts, rockets, landing on the moon, all that unimportant stuff. But as much as that control room image has been burned into my mind, it's set to be replaced thanks to a story shared with us by subreddit user Cosmic Vibes. He says there's a new article on Hackaday this week that details the computer system used by NASA for vehicle telemetry inside Hangar AE. So get ready for this, Neil. In 1986, NASA was on the hunt for a budget-conscious solution to process information about launch vehicle telemetry that could be disseminated to various departments throughout the company. First, they thought about Apple, who just launched the Macintosh, but its closed architecture meant that the engineers couldn't really get what they wanted out of it. So instead, they went with, can you guess, Neil?
There's only one sensible choice, isn't there, John? Has to be the Commodore Amiga.
How did you know, Neil? Was it the maniacal grin on my face as I recounted the story? That's right, Neil. It was the Amiga. And as the systems started to age, as these Amigas started to age, the top brass at NASA wanted those Amigas replaced with Windows units, Windows NT or Windows 95 computers. And when the engineers said they weren't powerful enough, they suggested DEC Alphas. Neil, I had no idea that DEC was still manufacturing computers in the 90s. We covered a story about their PDP, recreation a couple months ago. But in fact, just as an aside, I was doing research for this story, and I discovered that DEC was actually acquired in June 1998 by Compaq. And at the time, that was the largest merger in the history of the computer industry. I mean, that's pretty crazy considering neither DEC or Compaq are exactly at the forefront of technology anymore.
No, I mean, they certainly held a huge amount of weight, those two names, still in the late 90s, Compaq especially. But my first ever experience of working in IT was in an office with DEC Alpha machines. And those machines were running Windows NT with DEC servers in the background. And it always felt really cool when you saw the Alpha name. It would appear in white text on a blue background as NT started to boot up. But you could already see at that point that was the way DEC was going. They were producing beige box PCs. Yes, they still had their own special architecture in there and their own CPUs and Microsoft. People forget Windows NT, not the 9X, but Windows NT was made to support different architectures and be adaptable from the start. And it was a really solid system, Windows NT on a DEC Alpha machine. And it felt really cool. And this was hard. The nice thing about this was hardware that I couldn't have dreamed of owning a DEC Alpha machine at home, but I could instantly use it because it was running Windows NT on there, which I was familiar with. So I really loved that, and I was sad to see DEC go and be swallowed up by Compaq when it was.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I had no idea any of that stuff existed. So anyway, getting back to our NASA story, Windows PCs weren't powerful enough. DECs were too expensive. So why not just buy more Amigas? Well, according to Gary Jones, who was then the principal systems engineer for NASA, the heads of NASA thought the Amigas, quote, just didn't cost enough. That's typical government bureaucracy for you, Neil.
I think you just found your new catchphrase, John. Why not just buy more Amigas? It's the answer to
That's
everything.
right.
It's
It's the answer to everything.
But I do like to imagine that there's a warehouse somewhere at NASA that's just full of boxes of Amiga 500 Batman packs, or even better, more suitable would be the Flight of Fantasy bundle that the Amiga 500 did. So just boxes and boxes of them fill in a NASA warehouse somewhere. Must be the case.
Yes, yeah. It appears that Amigas were used at NASA all the way up until 2006. Unbelievable. And one even came up for sale a few years back that sold for over $5,000.
Wow.
So it's amazing to me that these machines were in service for that long. Of course, there's also the famous story reported just a few years ago that Amigas are still controlling the heating and cooling systems of 19 schools in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And now, Neil, you've spent your fair share amount of time in hardware support. Did you ever see like a bank of BBC Micros controlling a supermarket inventory, or like a server rack of ZX Spectrums doing bank ledgers?
No, I think the best I could probably do is a 486 PC that was running part of a CCTV system, and that was around 2016, so it was seriously outdated by that point. I went to see it because the hard drive had unsurprisingly failed, and when I opened it up, it had like an inch of dust and grime inside this machine. It was horrible. But unfortunately, it wasn't a company where I could take the 486 home and have it for myself. So that was a bit
You couldn't
sad.
just be like, I'm going to take this out to the dumpster, and then it goes in the back of your car.
And I also remember supporting several bakeries and I can't remember the name of the system, but basically they were still dialing in, it was a modern PC, but they would pop up a terminal screen to log into what was essentially an emulated version of an old IBM back-end system and do all of their stock control in that.
Really?
I'm afraid I can't remember the name of that system, but someone will point it out in the comments, I'm sure. And it was like you're on a modern PC, but then within the window you're on an old school terminal with the green text on the background.
That exact thing happens here at the school district that I teach at. We have an environment called green screen that basically turns a modern PC into a terminal, essentially. And the reason why we keep it around is because it's so much faster to use the keyboard-based interface for the secretaries to go and do scheduling and things like that. Plus, these secretaries, it's the same old story where you have people that have been in the system for 40 years. They refuse to learn anything new, refuse to change. And so green screen, ambles on into the future.
So let's get back to the NASA control room, John. Have you seen the Tesla, or have you been watching the Blue Shepard launches that have been going on?
I love all that stuff.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but if you see the control rooms for these places now, they just look like gaming PCs set up on IKEA furniture, or worse still, just laptops kind of thrown around on desks. And I know it's all perfectly suitable and amazing things have been achieved and everything, but it all has that feeling when you watch these launches of like visiting a doctor and the doctor's not wearing the white coat or doesn't have the stethoscope around his neck.
Right.
There are certain things that you expect, and there's an order of things when it comes to the chaos of launching fleshy humans up into space on a rocket. And part of that order for me is an environment in which you've got this environment where the destiny of these astronauts is decided through the push of a button on a computer. And I want that place to look like science fiction. I want it to look like it's 30 years ahead of where we are now, and not like a LAN party, which is what it looks like. Is it just me?
Yeah, and it's not just you. If I had all of Elon's money, I would build myself a command center that looks just like, the one in Houston. And even if it was completely non-functional, I would have it all lit up, and I would have people sitting there, and I would take, publicity photos and shoot all the videos and things while the real people were doing stuff on the IKEA furniture in the next room. It's good PR.
It would have the added bonus of throwing your competition off the scent. They'd be like, what machines are those? What are they using? They must have something really special. And it's just,
are those decks?
iPads.
Oh my gosh. Well, if you know any stories, fine listeners of retro computers still plugging away at real life activities, leave us a note in the comments.
Our final story this week was submitted by user Pajako6502, and he linked us to NME.com. So even the New Music Express love retro gaming these days, John. And it's all about a clash of old and new. The game in question is The Simpsons Hit and Run, which was released in 2003. Came out on the GameCube, PS2, Xbox, and on the PC, which is what I played it on. And this game was essentially Grand Theft Auto in a Simpsons world. It gave us the combination of an open world game and familiar characters, which instantly made it really popular. And some actually argue that this is the greatest Simpsons tie-in game ever made. Now, I would argue that there are others up there with it. One for me that's probably top of the list was Krusty's Super Fun House on the Super Nintendo. I thought that was a really great game, possibly the best to date. But in terms of this game, or any other Simpsons games for that matter, but did you play Hit and Run or any other Simpsons games, John?
I played the Immortal Classic Bart versus the Space Mutants on the Nintendo. And when I say Immortal Classic, I mean Immortal Dud. That game was no good. I'm surprised that we haven't covered it on Amigos yet, because I know it did get an Amiga port. But I never played Hit and Run. It came out in 2003, which for me was at a time in my life where I just wasn't interested in new video games. I was at the height of my career as a retro collector and player. But I do love the idea of Simpsons Hit and Run. I mean, a GTA game where you're in Springfield and you're running around with all the wacky characters in the Simpsons universe. I mean, how can you lose with that?
Yeah, it was a great idea. And there were at least 27 Simpsons games dating back all the way back to the much-loved 4-player arcade cabinet, which was in 1991. Always a classic and one to gather around in the same way that you would Gauntlet or NBA Jam with your friends. And I always remember on that arcade, it had the digitized Simpsons music playing. It had the clouds that would appear and separate with the Simpsons logo behind it, and it was quite something to see that, to see something that looks like it comes straight off of your television at home, but in an arcade, and essentially it was playable. It wasn't falling into that same category of being a cartoon playing from a Laserdisc in the same way as the game that you mentioned earlier, Dragon's Lair. This was actually a playable game. Other notable mentions include Bart versus the Space Mutants, which was bundled in the Amiga Cartoon Classics pack. I wasn't a fan of it, I have to be honest. No. But it did have a fun intro sequence, cartoony intro sequence.
Yeah, the whole part of the game, except for the actual game, and even the concept of the game is pretty good. But the gameplay, the controls, take a pass if you haven't tried it out. Don't play it.
Yeah, and they've been brave with what they've done with the Simpsons name. You know, they haven't held back. You've had Simpsons Hit and Run. You've had Simpsons Wrestling, Simpsons Bowling. You know, they'll try anything and everything.
Yeah.
And also a game called Road Rage, which came out in exactly the same year as Hit and Run, but that was more of a crazy taxi style game and didn't rate well. You'd probably be disappointed if you went out to get Hit and Run and you accidentally came back with Road Rage, which is an accident that you could probably easily make. Or if you sent your mum or dad to go out and get the game, they could have easily made, and you would have been pretty disappointed with that.
Sure.
However, the reason all of this Simpsons talk is in NME.com this week is because a developer by the name of Rubes has conducted a little experiment. He's tried to create a modern remake of Hit and Run in just 1 week, using Unreal Engine 5 to make it. So he's really rapidly developed this thing. And there's a great video on YouTube in which he explains how all of this has been achieved. And if you consider the size of the team that was needed to recreate the Simpsons world in full 3D in 2003, even on the technology back then, PlayStation 2s and Xboxes, it would have been an impossible task for one person to do, especially in a week. So in this video, he explains how he managed it. He found some old tools which helped him to rip the assets from the original game, including the 3D world itself, the textures to go on it, and then the textures, actually that's a big point in the video, there's something that he had to improve on because he wanted to scale this thing up to 4K resolutions. So he was really smart about the way he approached this. And he used a bit of software you may have heard of called Gigapixel AI to automatically scale up all of those really small 2003 textures to a 4K level. So that really helped him. And yes, before anyone asks, he has turned RTX on in this thing. So you can use your bang up-to-date graphics card to see it.
All that Simpsons hair will be flowing in the breeze.
Exactly.
Isn't that the big thing with the RTX is like Laura Croft's hair and all that stuff?
And the way the light bounces off of Homer Simpson's forehead and all of that, yeah. A problem I have to deal with daily myself.
Oh, yes.
But he also goes into how the characters were animated for this remake. And before long, he had Homer Simpson running around Springfield with those ray-traced graphics. And it is amazing. It really is amazing to see how he's achieved all of this using modern tools. And because the game is based on a cartoon, the game models and the scenery and everything, they really do lend themselves well to being scaled up. There's not an obvious lack of detail in these things. It's just a style that continues to work well when it's scaled up. So it looks really, really great. Now, I won't spoil the whole video for you, but he does go on to add music and sound. He goes on to add physics to the game, items to collect in the game, and crucially, vehicles to drive all in 1 week. And he completes his objective, which was to make the first mission of the game completely playable. So that's where we're up to with it. Yeah, he's done a really, really good job. And I noticed also this week we saw Quake get a 25th anniversary remake. A complete Quake remake and an official remake. This wasn't one guy trying to rapidly develop it. And it's come along really nicely. And perhaps that's the incentive you need, John, to finally play Quake, because I know you haven't played it
I've been
yet.
tempted. You know, I saw LGR playing it on that old school CRT, and maybe this is the time. It's the 2020s. It's the time for Quake.
It's the time, John. But if you could pick any retro game to get the full RTX treatment, the Unreal or the Unity engine treatment, and get a makeover for the present day, what would you pick?
Well, I guess you'd have to start. You don't have to, but my mind immediately went to 3D based games, and of course, and there's sort of a line in the sand for me personally when it comes to retro, and I tend to only think about retro games taking place in a 2D space. So I sort of chose my answer on sort of the dawn of the 3D era, and I thought about a game like Wolfenstein 3D. You know, the trick would be to keep the nostalgic charm of the original, but update it with this new engine. And I was thinking about there's a game called 3D Dot Game Heroes. Are you familiar with this game, Neil?
No, I'm not. No.
So it's sort of a Zelda knockoff, but it's a 2D Zelda-like game, but they've replaced all of the sprites with pixels, 3D pixels, so when you hit something, the pixels bounce off and things like that. And so I would love to see something like that with the original Wolfenstein, where they kept it looking sort of primitive, but 3Dized it and made all the textures look super cool with this new engine. So there's my answer for you.
So almost like a remake that keeps its original charm, has almost like a Minecraft RTX style to it.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
know, voxely things flying out of everything. So
yeah,
I can get behind that. That sounds fun. There have been various Wolfenstein remakes. The latest one from 2019 was called Wolfenstein Young Blood. And it looks kind of like teen fiction meets Nazi slaying. It is certainly something to see from the trailers. I've never played it myself.
I don't know how I missed that one, Neil.
I don't know. It's not the direction I imagined Wolfenstein to go in, but obviously people pay money to use the name that is franchised out, and these things happen.
These things happen.
Yeah. I think I'd like to see a modern RTX remake of a game that was mentioned earlier in the show, and that's those Novalogic games, particularly Comanche, which was a fantastic helicopter simulation. It leaned on the side of action over simulation, but it was very much a simulation because it still managed to reward you for flying well as it would in a simulation, but with extra explosions and shorter distances between the waypoints and things like that. So you were into the action a lot quicker than you would be a traditional simulation. I love the series. The problem with a modern remake is that the wonderful landscapes from the game were made of voxels. So that's a totally different way of creating worlds and rendering them than the polygon-based systems that modern graphics cards can accelerate. This was all accelerated by the CPU back then, and you know, it did a wonderful job of it. It was incredible to see to go to rolling landscapes with voxels, having been used to sort of a flat plane in a flight simulator, and then maybe a single pyramid in the middle of the landscape. Suddenly you had these rolling landscapes, and they did a really great job of it. So if they could somehow remake that, I think we could get enough. We could pack enough polygons into a game.
You know, I think computers are good enough these days where you could have simulated voxels that are actually pixels that act exactly like voxels used to and look just like them. So I think that's totally doable in the right hands.
Yeah, I think so. I'd love to see that. The big problem with voxels, and I think the reason it really didn't take off, was because of the problems in animating them. It was great for scenery, but if you wanted to turn that into a detailed character and then animate the character, it was just impossible. So they kind of died a death. But in terms of games I'd like to see remade, that's the one. That's the one for me. Anyway, the Simpsons Hit and Run remake video is well worth 10 minutes of your time. Give it a watch. It's presented with really good humor as well. It's a nice, easy to watch video, and it gives you a real sense of the power of modern development tools and just why, in the right hands, indie developers can achieve such brilliant things that would have traditionally taken an entire studio of people to do. All the links for this and any other story that you've enjoyed today, you can find in the show notes.
So, Neil, last week's community question of the week was, what do you think of the A500 Mini? And we got tons and tons of responses. Shockingly, people are interested in talking about the A500 Mini and planting their flag on one side or other of the debate. So
it was a popular show, John. We got a lot of views last week. And it could be because the thumbnail had the A500 Mini and the title did. It's certainly a topic of conversation.
I just like to take this opportunity to announce that we're actually changing the name of the show to This Week in the A500 Mini.
You just
That's the
doubled
key to
viewers.
success. Yeah. So we did get some good responses from Reddit. We're going to read the top 3 most upvoted responses. The first one comes from Richie Nichols. He says, I would love to have a full-size version of this, but I'll buy the Mini because I'm sure that good sales will help the likelihood of the full-size version being produced. And we did talk about that a little bit, I think.
We did touch on that and the fact that when they did the C64 Mini, they didn't mention anything about a Maxi. And then the Maxi sales, I think they accounted for about 20% of the overall sales of the C64 recreation, but they've done it the other way around this week. So they've this time they've said that there will be a Maxi, or they're hoping to do a Maxi of the A500. So yeah, how do you approach it? Do you do like Richie's doing and buy the Mini to support it and hope that goes towards making the Maxi, or do you sit back and wait for the Maxi and hope enough other people buy it so that the Maxi exists? It's
right.
A bit of a catch-22, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's classic Commodore management.
It is. Give the consumer so many choices, they don't know what to do, end up buying nothing, and you go out of business.
Nailed it.
Quinn Mang says, given the C64 Mini or Maxi, I expect the A500 Mini will be a good product, but it's too pricey for me. I've supported Cloanto in the past by purchasing Amiga and C64 Forever products, so I already have license to play several games and use the OS and Kickstart. So for me, all I would be paying for is the shell, the retro tank mouse, and the CD32 lookalike pad, but I'm okay without those.
Yeah, I mean,
I imagine that's...
Yeah, your point of reference is the amount of time and money that you've already spent on creating the experience that you want. Now, if you're going from a standing start and you haven't done any of that, I think the price is perfectly reasonable for what you're getting, for the ease of use, for the quality of the product. I don't personally think it's overpriced, but in that context where you've put so much time and money into it, yeah, it's not for you, and that's fine.
Exactly. And finally, Reading Glasses Man says, if I can run Workbench and therewith productivity apps connected to the interwebs on the Mini through the use of a USB keyboard, then I could well be all in on this. He says, I'll be one of those suckers to be annoyed when a full-size one with a functional keyboard comes out. But but if it is only games and locked to only games, which is unlikely, then I'll likely avoid this like COVID. But as Gentleman Neil said in the podcast, Gentleman Neil, that's a great name for you. That mouse will be something a great many retro fans will hanker after, and it might be a good decision to sell that on its own, regardless of the success of the Mini itself.
I think we discussed that it does support WHD load. It does. I'm pretty sure it supports your own hard drive image files, or you can add ADFs. Either way, yes, you're going to be able to use Workbench on it. I think it would be madness for them to try and lock it down, wouldn't it? Knowing what Amiga users are like and what they want to do, it would be crazy to try and lock it down.
I agree. I think you'll be able to run whatever you want on this thing. And he also poses a question within a question. He says, I wonder what a collective noun for retro fans should be. A history of retro fans? Or maybe a floppy of retro fans? So that's another thing to ponder this week, Neil. What would you say?
I think I almost want that to be our question of the week. What is a collective of retro fans called?
I like that. I like that. Why don't we make that our question of the week this week?
Okay.
So our question of the week this week is, what is the best collective noun for a group of retro fans? Please post your responses in the subreddit, and we'll read the top 3 most upvoted responses on the air next week.
This Week in Retro was presented by Neil from RMC and John Shawler. It was produced by me, Duncan Stiles. The podcast version of the show is available through your favourite podcaster, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and the video version is available on the This Week in Retro YouTube channel.
Join our community subreddit at r/thisweekinretro to suggest and vote on stories we cover on the show. If you watch This Week in Retro on YouTube, please give us a like and subscribe to help us reach new viewers.
If you'd like to support the show, please check out the links to our Patreon and Ko-fi pages in the show notes or in the YouTube description. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week for more up-to-date news for out-of-date tech.